our presentation. So thanks again for joining us today. This is the Science of Learning Part 2, Learning and Memory. And I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Courtney O'Hagan. And I'm going to see if she can introduce herself. If she's, there she is. Yes, excellent.
Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney O'Hagan. I'm an associate professor at SUNY Broome and the chair of psychology and human services. And I teach a lot of general psychology. And so I think that Jamie and I together make a good team on this presentation.
Exactly. Yeah, it's been fun working with Courtney to get this together for sure. So just to remind you all, this is a play in 3 parts, and you don't necessarily have to attend all 3 parts to get something out of it. But yesterday we talked about the brain and kind of the molecular and structural parts of learning and memory. And today we're going to talk more about this middle section here. Oh, I got to turn on my annotate. I apologize. This middle section here with the elephant, and elephants typically get associated with great memories because they actually really do have great memories. And then finally on Friday morning at 10 o'clock, we're going to kind of bring both of these things together, the concepts of what's going on in the brain and these memory phenomenon, and pull them all together and give you some strategies, techniques to teach better in your classes, and to give your students some study tips, some suggestions for how they can learn information better. And it's a kind of a win-win all around. With that, I'll just talk briefly about what we're going to discuss today. We're going to start first by talking about the different systems of memory, and that includes working memory and long-term. And then the different types of memory within those systems, the declarative and non-declarative system. We're really going to take a broad overview and only talk about a portion that's relevant to what you need to know for Friday. And otherwise, it's like a minimum of 3 lectures, and we would be here all week just on memory, right? And then we'll talk about some phenomena associated with memory that then again tie in on Friday. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Courtney.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So we're going to start off by talking about the 3 systems of memory. In psychology, we really refer to these 3 systems as kind of an overarching paradigm where we can then go in and talk specifically about each one. So the 3 types of memory are sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And I think Jamie did a great job picking pictures that go with each one, because later on we'll talk about pairing new information with something familiar to you. So each system that we mentioned here varies along at least 2 important dimensions. The first is span, or how much this type of memory can hold, and durations for how long that information can be held. So in terms of span, how much information each system can hold is very limited in sensory memory, and somewhat limited in short-term memory, about 5 to 7 items. We'll talk more specifically about that in a minute. And the amount that can be held in long-term memory really is unlimited. There is no sort of gigabyte limit the way there is on your phone or your computer. And then duration, in terms of how much each one, or I'm sorry, how long each one can be held. So over the longest period of time, sensory memory can only hold things really briefly for about 2 to 10 seconds. Short-term memory can only hold information for about 10 to 30 seconds. And which is surprising, because I think a lot of times we talk about short-term memory as if it's something that happened to us yesterday. Oh, I have a bad short-term memory because I don't remember where I put my keys. Or I have a bad short-term memory because, I don't remember what I ate for breakfast 3 days ago. That's, in psychology, short-term memory is much shorter than what we talk about it in our everyday language. So it's only about 10 to 30 seconds that information can stay in our short-term memory. And for long-term memory, that information can potentially stay for your entire life. You might remember things that happened to you when you were in 1st grade, for example. But some things do fade away from long-term memory as well. So it can hold information for a very long period of time, but doesn't necessarily always hold that information there. And then in terms of, I just want to talk briefly about short-term memory. There's 2 different kinds of memory that we can hold in short-term memory. There's iconic and echoic memory. So iconic memory is memory for visual information. And generally, I remember I said that sensory memory, oh, I'm sorry. I was talking about subcategories of sensory memory, not short-term. Remember we said that information can only be held in short-term memory very briefly. So iconic memory, which is memory for images or visual information, fades after about 1 second. And echoic memory, which is memory for auditory information, can fade after about 1 to 2 seconds from sensory memory, unless we pay more attention to it, and then it will move to short-term memory. And this is important, I think, for our purposes, because often when we're presenting information to students, we're presenting them with both a visual and an auditory, kind of like what we're doing right here. There's pictures that go with the lecture that we're presenting. So it's important for us to keep in mind that there's these two different kinds of memory that are involved in sensory memory. And then when they are paid attention to and deemed to be important, we can move them into short-term memory to think about them a little bit more. And then hopefully the goal is to move it to long-term memory. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So I mentioned that I did mention short-term memory, long-term memory, and sensory memory. They are part of the main memory systems, but for our purposes, we're really going to focus on short-term and long-term memory. And much more specifically, we're going to focus on working memory, which is considered to be a part of short-term memory. It's the part of our memory that allows us to manipulate information. Think about when you're standing at a checkout and you pay cash for something and you try to calculate how much change you'll get back. That is how we use working memory. It's how we manipulate information, but it is still part of short-term memory, because if we get interrupted at some point while we're thinking about what change the cashier owes us, we can forget really quickly that information that was in our short-term memory. So we're going to focus on working memory and long-term memory for the purposes of what we really need to know now. And this is just a depiction of sort of what we're going to talk about going forward. So working memory is one part. Then long-term memory has two different sub-branches, two different types of memory, subdivisions we call them, declarative and non-declarative. And then declarative memory has two different types of memory in it as well, episodic and semantic. So episodic is memory for memory for events, and semantic is memory for facts. And then with non-declarative memory, which is also sometimes called implicit memory, which we'll talk more about in a minute, we have a few different types. We have priming, skill learning, and conditioning. We're going to focus mostly on probably more skill learning here for non-declarative memory. Okay, we can move on to the next one. That is Jamie. I'm just going to answer this question. Can information move to short-term to from short-term to long-term memory? Luis, yes, that's the goal, actually. Information, if you want it to be stored in long-term memory, is actually to move it from short-term to long-term. We're going to talk about how that happens in our mind and in our brain a little bit later. So Jamie's going to talk more specifically about working memory as part of the short-term memory system.
Great. And that's a good question, Luis. Or Lewis, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. I added an E at the end in my head. So working memory itself, like, we don't typically talk about it necessarily in a general psych class, but it's this kind of bridge between the information that's in your short-term memory and information that's in your long-term memory. And that information that we think is important, that we need to attend to, that we need to practice with, work with, is how we get it into our long-term memory. So it's not completely distinct from short-term memory, but it's not short-term memory itself. So I just want to make sure it's almost like a Venn diagram of what working and short-term memory are. It's the memory that we use to plan and carry out our behavior, like Courtney was talking about, with planning out how much you're going to pay, etc. And working with this memory, so working memory actually has been found to correlate with intellectual aptitudes, and especially fluid intelligence, rather than looking at short-term memory, which is why we tend to look at strategies involving working memory when it comes to teaching and learning more so than short-term memory itself. and most of that is because working memory itself is measuring, it reflects the processes that are involved as well as the storage. So you might find yourself, or you might notice your students have a higher or a lower span of working memory. And what that allows somebody with a higher working memory span or capacity is they're able to better avoid distraction, and they're able to work with larger chunks of information when they're first presented with information. And that allows them to move quickly to relating it to other episodes, other informations. They're more easily able to scaffold information versus individuals who have a lower capacity in their working memory. And that doesn't necessarily mean that students who have a high versus a low capacity working memory are better academic students. It just deals with like processing speed and how much information they can work with at one time. Students that tend to have the lower working memories can actually outperform academically the students that make the rapid leaps, because they're attending to that information more intently. They're working with it for longer. And the more you work with information in your working memory, the more likely it is to be placed into long-term memory appropriately. So it doesn't give anyone an advantage in the long term, but it might give somebody an advantage, like in a short term episode. So like if you presented information and you gave a pop quiz, those individuals with a high span working memory might perform better on that pop quiz than those with the lower capacity or lower span working memory. But at the end of the class, you might not see any differences between the two. So it's just kind of to talk about how the information that we can hold in our working memory impacts the speed with which we can work with memory. As we take out information or are presented with new information, like you're being presented with right now, we move it we move information that kind of correlates to it from our neocortex, right, where we talked about yesterday, where our long-term memory is predominantly held, and we move it to our working memory with this new stuff. And so we can think of it like, a crafting table or a workbench, where you're going to pull out the supplies that you need from long-term memory to help you scaffold this learning, and you're going to bring in the new supplies that are being added to it. And working memory, like short-term memory, is limited in how much we can put on those tables to kind of manipulate at one time. So we know that we're limited to like 4 to 5 supplies. And we're going to do a little experiment to kind of demonstrate this in just a minute. But as we get more experienced with a task, so the more times you would maybe talk about memory, or the more times you would talk about the brain, or the more times that you maybe do your times table, right? You can work with larger and larger chunks of information that then expands how much working memory can hold. And we're going to talk about chunking in a little bit. But next, we're going to dive into a quick little thing, and I hope you can work with us here. You don't necessarily have to write things down. You could type it at your computer on, your notepad, or just a little Post-it note. But I'm going to show you a sequence of numbers, and I'm going to read them at a 1 second per number pace. And then I'm going to kind of hide those numbers, and we're going to see how many of those numbers you can recall, or you actually got done correctly. Okay. Does everybody understand the concept? I'm going to read them. I'm going to hide the numbers. And then you're going to, when I hide the numbers, you're going to write down the numbers that I just showed you. Okay. So the first set of numbers is, hang on, sorry, 9, 5, 2. So go ahead and write those down. Okay, so now you can check your work and see how you did with those numbers. Most people with their short-term capacity or span can handle three numbers without too much trouble. Now I'm going to present another series of numbers. 2, 9, 7, 3. So go ahead and write those down. Okay, so how did everybody do with the 4 numbers? I imagine if you guys want to go ahead and use the controls on your you can do your hand raised or clap. So go ahead and raise your hand if you actually got those numbers correct. And that's how kind of we'll pull. Okay, good. Thanks, Louis. Carrie, great. Okay, so here's our next series of numbers. Are we ready? 5, 7, 4, 9, 2. Okay, go ahead and write those down. Okay, how'd everybody do? Raise your hand if you still got them. All right, I see quite a few hands raised. Great. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next series of number. Ready? 6, 2, 7, 3, 8, 4. Okay, write those down. All right, hands raised if you got that. All right. A lot of people, excellent. You guys have some strong short-term memories. All right, we're gonna go on to the next one. Ready? 2, 4, 1, 8, 6, 4, 7. Go ahead and write those down. Okay, ready? How'd you guys do? 2, 4, 1, 8, 6, 4, 7. How'd everybody do? Hands up. Hands. If you don't have it anymore, put your hands down. Okay, great. Okay, next one. 3, 9, 5, 8, 4, 1, 8, 9. Go ahead and write that down. Okay, how'd everybody do with this one? Raise your hand if, okay, we're starting to lose some numbers here. That's not a surprise, right? We were talking about the span of our short-term memory. Okay, and now we're gonna do the next one. 8, 4, 6, 3, 1, 7, 4, 2, 5. Go ahead and write that down. Okay, how'd everybody do? Hands up if you got it. Okay, we're down to 7, right? We had almost everybody in the first round, and now we're down to 7 people who are able to hold that number in their short-term memory here. Okay, and then the last one. 5, 2, 9, 3, 4, 6, 1, 8, 5, 7. Good luck. Okay, how did everybody do? Anybody have it? Okay, so we have just 5. All right. So I'm going to shift over here to Courtney, and she's going to talk about something that relates to that experiment that we just ran. And I'm going to check on the chat.
So lost my place a little bit there. What Jamie was demonstrating with that activity really was how much information your short-term memory can hold. And I mentioned before that it has a limitation on how much short-term memory can hold. And it's been put forth since the 1950s by a researcher named George Miller, that 7 is the magic number that we can hold in our short-term memory, 7 items plus or minus 2. So most adults, their digit span, how much they can hold in their short-term memory, is about 5 to 10 numbers, but the average is about 7, which is why the magic number appears to be 7. It's really hard for us to retain more than 7 pieces of information, plus or minus 2, in our short-term memory. So once you get past that 7 numbers, which is what happened in that exercise that you were doing, your short-term memory really becomes overwhelmed and you can't remember all of the individual digits. So this is what we're going to talk about later, why it's important to learn some strategies for expanding our short-term memory. And one of the ways we can do that is through chunking, which we'll talk about later. But this is why telephone numbers, which are more than 7 digits, are chunked up with the dashes in between. Obviously, there's different meaning to the area code and things like that. But our social security numbers are also chunked in this way for us, knowing that short-term memory has difficulty holding more than about 7 items. But if we chunk them, those chunks become in items and we can hold more in short-term memory. And what's interesting is recently psychologists have argued that potentially the magic number of how much we can hold in short-term memory is more like 3 or 4, and maybe not as big as 7 or not as many as 7. Okay, we can move on to the next slide, I think. All right, so one of the things to consider as instructors is something referred to as cognitive load, which is related to memory. So cognitive load is the amount of information that our working memory can hold at one time. Not digits necessarily, but the amount of information in working memory that we can manipulate. So since working memory has a kind of limited capacity, really our instructional methods that we use should avoid overloading our working memory. And we shouldn't include instructional activities that don't really contribute directly to the information we're trying to get students to learn. And cognitive load can be divided into 3 different types. There's intrinsic cognitive load, extrinsic cognitive load, and there's germane cognitive load. So intrinsic cognitive load refers to the number of things that have to be processed at the same time in working memory. And this is affected really by the inherent complexity or difficulty of the information that students are trying to hold in working memory. So the more difficult a task is, or the material that they're trying to learn is, the more intrinsic cognitive load they're going to have. Extrinsic cognitive load is really the way extraneous. Man, I'm trying to keep a lot of things in my working memory right now. And I apologize if I'm a little off my game. I'm feeling a little under the weather today. I'm not sure why, but I apologize if I hope I'm making sense still. Okay, so extraneous cognitive load is the way information is presented to learners. So we need to make sure that our instructional techniques that require learners to engage our working memory are not extraneous. They're not extra information. It needs to be directly related to the material that we are trying to get students to learn. Then there is germane cognitive load, and this refers to the mental work that it takes within working memory to place new knowledge into existing frameworks in our mind. And those existing frameworks are called schemas, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, but those are ways in which we permanently store information. Kind of like yesterday when we were talking about reconfiguring the neural circuits in our brain from when we were children, that we learn individual information like individual numbers, and then we work from there and learn addition and multiplication and then algebra and calculus. Germane cognitive load is that process of how we integrate new information into our existing schemas and then reconfigure those neural connections. So what we should keep in mind as instructors is that good instructional design and our own course preparation really can be used to reduce the cognitive load that we place on students. So we have to be careful how much we're presenting at one time, and also how difficult the information is, which seems obvious, but it might not be to everyone. Okay. So we talked about how short-term memory and then also working memory has a limited amount that it can hold. And I like this meme because oftentimes when we're meeting new people, they will tell us their name and then they'll immediately forget it, right? And part of that is because you got distracted part of the way through holding that information within your short-term or working memory. So some of the ways that we can expand the capacity of our short-term or working memory is through a process called chunking. So chunking is organizing information into meaningful groupings, which allows us to expand the amount we can hold in short-term memory. So I mentioned this before, but this is why we chunk phone numbers into, we put the dashes in between so it's easier for us to chunk that information and then store it in our working memory and then our short-term memory. So all of you probably have a chunk of whatever your area code is. Like ours is 607. So that's not 3 individual digits I have to remember. 607 is a meaningful chunk to me that refers to our area code. So that's why a lot of information that is digits, we write it in such a way that it is already chunked. And this helps us move that information from short-term memory to long-term memory, which is the ultimate goal, is that we know the information where we remember it. So here's a good example of how we would chunk information. 1-800 numbers are a great example of this. So if you've ever looked up a number on the internet and then tried to like type it into your phone real quick, that 1-800 is like its own chunk, right? You don't have to remember 1800. It's already meaningfully chunked in your mind of 1-800. And then you only have to remember 867 as a chunk and then 5309 as a chunk. My camera was right in front of the last digit on that. So there's a couple more things I wanted to say about expanding our short-term memory. So one other strategy for expanding short-term memory is rehearsal. And you might be familiar with this because you probably just used it. So when Jamie said that you needed to remember the digits that were on the screen, did you do that thing where you said in your head the digits? You're like 867, 5309, and then you told yourself over and over in your head those digits so that you can remember them later. At some point throughout you rehearsing that information, it becomes too much to hold in short-term memory, and then everything kind of falls apart and you can't hold it in short-term memory anymore. But rehearsal is a strategy that we often use even without, that was a good joke, Dave, even without really anyone having to teach us this. We often rehearse information to keep it alive in our short-term or working memory. And this is often called maintenance rehearsal, where we're repeating that set of numbers or that information over and over. We do this often, like if we're looking up phone numbers, or like if I'm looking up what Jamie's office number is in a new building, I might look at the directory and say, okay, she's in, second floor, office 204, second floor, office 204. And I repeat that to myself as I walk up the stairs. And the interesting thing is, remember that short-term memory is also limited in the amount of time we can hold things, right? So if it takes me more than about 30 seconds to get to Jamie's office, chances are I will have forgotten which office number it is, or I might remember part of the information, but not the entire set of information. So I tell this to my students a lot, is if you often feel like you're forgetting things that were just in your head, that's not your fault. It doesn't mean you have a bad memory. It just means that whatever was in your short-term memory or your working memory, you got distracted and your attention shifted, and now something different is in your working memory. And so you've lost that piece of information. And so that's why the goal is to move information from short-term to long-term, so that when you go to retrieve it, it can be in working memory, but still exist in long-term memory. So you can go back and forth and bring that information back to working memory. So another strategy for enhancing the amount that can be held in short-term memory is something called elaborative rehearsal. And you may have heard of this because we commonly teach it to people who are going to be instructors. And we often sometimes teach it to our students as strategies for studying. So elaborative rehearsal refers to linking information in our short-term memory to something we already know or something that is already meaningful to us. So when I teach the neuroscience section to my students and I talk about the hippocampus, which is very relevant in this lecture as well, I tell them to picture a hippo standing on a college campus. Hippocampus, and that hippos on campus have to remember, which building to go to. Or another example of elaborative rehearsal is if you tell students, okay, picture an elephant. An elephant always remembers, that's a sort of phrase we use a lot, right? That an elephant never forgets. So picture, instead of an elephant, a hippo never forgets. And then we know that hippocampus is involved in memory. So tying that new word, that new vocabulary of hippocampus to something that you already know, like that elephants have a good memory, can help you retain that information longer in short-term memory and give it more of a chance to work and move into long-term memory. So of course, elaborative rehearsal takes more mental effort, which is why oftentimes students don't use it the way that we would like them to while we're lecturing, because they often kind of zone out, right? And then their attention is not on what you're talking about, and they're not using it in working memory and relating it to things that they already know. So there's lots of ways that we can use elaborative rehearsal or tell our students how to use it. And we'll probably be talking more about this on Friday, but one of the things that is a good strategy for students is telling them to translate information that they've just learned into their own words. That's an example of elaborative rehearsal. Something like composing study questions and then answering them is a good use of elaborative rehearsal. Pairing a concept with a visual image that you're already familiar with, or linking new information to something personal. So a lot of times when we talk about mental health diagnoses in psychology class, students will come up with a person in their life that displays those symptoms. And I tell them that's a great way to remember what those symptoms are and what the profile of someone with that mental health problem looks like. And that's our goal, right, is for students to tie that new information that we're teaching them into existing long-term memory. And we can do that pretty well with elaborative rehearsal within short-term memory. So elaborative rehearsal is the clear winner when it comes to what is the best way for us to expand our short-term memory. All right, we'll discuss more techniques related to that on Friday. Let's now move on to talk about our long-term memory system, right? Because the goal of teaching students information and having them think about it in short-term and working memory is then for them to move that information to long-term memory so they can access it when they need to, or they can tie it into other information they already know. So we're going to talk now about the differences between two types of long-term memory: declarative, or sometimes referred to as explicit memory, and non-declarative, sometimes referred to as implicit memory. So we'll see how these types of memory work together as the information that students might learn is consolidated from working memory to learning long-term memory. So how that information is moved from working memory to long-term memory. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit next about long-term memory in general, and then we'll talk about the types of long-term memory. So long-term memory should be relatively enduring, from a few minutes to years. So the fact that you might remember what I talked about on the first slide of this presentation means you've moved it into long-term memory. It doesn't mean it's going to stay there forever, right? The more you use it, the more often those connections get strengthened, and the more likely it is that you'll remember that information when you need to know it. So we do lose a lot from long-term memory, but if you remember it for more than 30 seconds, it's made it to long-term memory. Who knows how long it will stay? But the retention of that information, and that is what the goal is, and that is what is stored in long-term memory. And it's information about facts, experiences, skills, anything that we've learned is part of what we've moved to long-term memory. So the final step in that process that we're talking about is to move information from short-term to long-term. I've said that multiple times. And our long-term memory has a massive capacity for storage. Some scientists even say that it really is unlimited. But if you were trying to pinpoint how much information could be stored in long-term memory, you might say it's something like 500 encyclopedias worth of information, each encyclopedia book being 1,500 pages long. So it's a ton of information that can be stored there. We don't often, we joke about how if you can't remember something, it's because my brain is full, right? I've just got too much stuff in there. I gotta lose some memory in order to store new memory. That's not necessarily true, even though it is fun to say. Really, as we learn, our memory becomes more interconnected. The neural pathways become more interconnected, and there really is no limit on how much that can hold. So the problem with our memory, especially if we are forgetting things a lot, isn't necessarily the storage space in long-term memory, but it's how that we encode or retrieve that information that can be problematic sometimes. And in terms of potential, we have so much capacity for long-term memory in terms of our synaptic connections, which we talked about last time, how memory is stored in those synaptic connections. We have enough capacity that you could compare it to the number of grains of sand on the planet. We have more capacity to learn information than there are grains of sand on the entire planet, which is hard to even comprehend. Okay, so let's talk about declarative versus non-declarative memory. So declarative memory is information that you're aware that you know, that you can declare. I can say, I know who the president of the United States is. I know what year it is. I know the definition of the word impossible. So declarative memory is information you know you're accessing from long-term memory, and you are able to say it to someone else or write it down or answer a question about it. You're able to access that information and you're aware that you're accessing it. And this is mostly what we're teaching our students is declarative information, or sometimes called explicit memory. Unless some of you might teach classes where you're teaching students things like finger movements on an instrument or muscle movements on a sport or a physical education course. Those are the only examples really I could think of that were not declarative memory, but everything else we're teaching students that is academic book learning, it's all considered declarative memory. And there are two types of declarative memory. There's semantic and episodic memory. So semantic memory, and maybe an easy way to remember what semantic memory is it's memory for semantics, right? So it's our knowledge of the world, ideas, concepts we've accumulated across the course of our lives. For example, things like the names of all 50 states, definitions of words, dates of historical events. Those are all examples of semantic facts that we have stored in memory, and that semantic memory is a type of declarative memory. Episodic memory, on the other hand, which is also a type of declarative memory, is memory for episodes of our life, which is a good way to remember what episodic means. So they are unique representations of our own personal experiences, and it's pretty complicated, right? So when we have a personal experience, like for example, the first time you went to an amusement park, I don't even know if I actually remember the first time I went to an amusement park, but I always use that example with students. Or maybe your first concert you ever went to, that is a better example. Those memories are complex, right? There's mental representations of the things you saw, the things you heard, the temperature that the outdoor arena was, or the sights and sounds, the emotions, how happy you were when you heard, your favorite Coldplay song, as I like to say with Jamie, because she recently shared something about the last concert she was at, probably before COVID, was a Coldplay concert with her girls. So all of that encompasses what the episode was. And remember, we said yesterday that the cortex, because it processes different experiences, right? So one part's processing visual information, one part's processing touch, temperature, pain. Not that there should be any pain involved in going to a concert, but different parts of our cortex are processing different information at any given time. And so that's where our memories are stored. And for an episodic memory, then you have to gather a lot of different bits of information in order to put that together into the episode that you're trying to remember. So this type of memory, episodic memory, involves many different cortical regions where information and memories are stored, so it's well beyond just using the hippocampus to index pieces of information like definitions of words. All right, so that's declarative memory. So there's semantic and episodic. And then for non-declarative memory, well, can we just go back one second, Jamie? Sorry. Non-declarative memory is, I just got to explain it real quick. It is sometimes referred to as implicit memory. This is memory that we are using for skills that we have learned, but we don't actually realize we're accessing memory, which is why it's called non-declarative. It's very difficult to verbalize this type of memory. So take, for example, driving. Driving starts out as a declarative memory and becomes a non-declarative memory, because when you drive, you're not thinking about, oh, this is the point at which I should turn the wheel slightly. This is the point at which I should press the brake, right? It becomes very automatic. It becomes procedural. And when information becomes procedural, then it is non-declarative. We just do the thing, perform the action without really realizing that we're relying on a former stored memory. So some examples, the reason why the woman tying her shoe is on the slide is because tying your shoe is a great example of non-declarative memory. Once we learn how to do it, it becomes motor memory, and our muscles just do the activity and we don't even think about it. We don't have to process it consciously. Oh, what do I do with the ties again? No, you just automatically do it. So the interesting thing, if we go back to what we were talking about yesterday with HM, the man who had his hippocampus removed, he lost his declarative memory, right? But he didn't lose non-declarative memory because they could teach him new skills like playing the piano and playing golf. He didn't remember that he knew how to play golf, but when they put the club in his hand, he was able to swing and he showed improvements based on the practice that they gave him. So he couldn't declare he knew how to play golf, but when you put the club in his hand, his body did the motions as if he remembered and had stored memory of muscle movements in that way. And I always thought that was one of the most interesting things that we learned about memory, is that it can be separated based on type of memory, where that information is stored and how it is used. So even without a hippocampus, you still could have non-declarative type of memory. Okay, so now we can move on to declarative memory. So we're just going to talk about it more in depth. I know I already talked about what it was, but we're going to talk about it much more in depth and sort of how it relates to what we're talking about here. So our declarative memory, this is a learning system that involves three fundamental parts: our working memory, our hippocampus, and the cortex. So they work together to form our declarative learning system. There are signals that come from the hippocampus to the cortex that help us retrieve and link together information that is distributed throughout different places in our cortex. And each time a student retrieves a piece of information, the hippocampus then strengthens those links between the information that's stored in different parts of the cortex. I once heard it explained, and this is just another analogy that might help you picture it, that distributed memory from different events is almost like little balloons that are stored in parts of the cortex, and it's your hippocampus's job to kind of gather the strings of those balloons and tie it together into the memory that you're familiar with. So it's another analogy, kind of like Jamie's analogy of the hippocampus being the index, right, to tell us where the pieces are stored so that we can put it all together. But every time a student retrieves pieces of information, the hippocampus helps us strengthen those links to where the distributed pieces are in the cortex so that it's easier for us to remember it next time and we can master certain material. So after memory is stored and consolidated in the cortex, this is a process that can take months, and it actually happens mostly while you're sleeping. This is when we consolidate and store information in the cortex. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But working memory is able to retrieve that information directly from the cortex without using the hippocampus as an index, once that information is well stored and those connections are strengthened, mostly through sleeping, and also retrieving it multiple times. So working within the information in the hippocampus and the working memory, this strengthens those connections that were initially loose and distributed so that you can easily get to them and they all come together very quickly, and you can declare that information as mastered, right? I can answer that essay question. I can correctly answer the multiple choice question because I've learned that information. So the more information that we take out of long-term memory and think about within our working memory and manipulate, the stronger those connections will be between the information that's stored in long-term memory in the cortex and using that information, taking it out via the hippocampus, the more times that we use that information in working memory, the stronger those connections will be. Which is why, think about those of you that are not in foreign languages. Do any of you remember, 100% of the vocabulary words you learned in foreign language in high school or college? No, I remember probably 20 Spanish words, and it's only because my daughter asks me what things mean, and I go, oh yeah, I kind of remember that, like agua means water, right? So the ones that we use most frequently are the ones that we will continue to store in long-term memory. And what we don't use, what we don't think about, what we don't take out of long-term memory and think about within working memory, that fades away. Remember, use it or lose it principle. Okay. So the next part is procedural memory, or sometimes called non-declarative memory. Procedural memory, we can think of it as a part, a redundant part of memory for our declarative memory system. So it's information that we are using without being completely conscious that we're using it. So with procedural learning, the information is, in terms of the neuroscience of it, is often sifted through and shifted from what we hear or see or feel into long-term memory through structures like the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia is involved in helping coordinate movements and motor movements. So that is an important structure for our procedural or non-declarative memory, but the hippocampus is also involved there too. So there's a circuitry loop that occurs inside the brain between the basal ganglia and the cortex, which enables us to learn sequences of actions and the thoughts associated with those sequences of actions that then can be stored in long-term memory. And we're not totally conscious of the fact that we're either storing it or that we're retrieving it. So these links that we create associated with the brain states and actions related to thinking, language, and song, those links are what we're talking about with the loops. And the more that we use that information, the better we get at those procedural movements. So think about this. Think about how hard it is. I don't know if those of you play golf. I think it's great because the otter is playing golf in the picture. But for those of you that play a sport or an instrument, think about how difficult it is for you to perform, hit the ball when people are watching you. So when people are watching you, oftentimes you get self-conscious and you start focusing on every aspect of your swing. You're consciously thinking to yourself, oh wait, gotta put shoulders back, gotta move arms a certain way. And as soon as you start consciously thinking about what you're supposed to do to hit the ball, your performance completely declines, which is why coaches will often say to athletes, get out of your head, right? Stop thinking so hard about what you're doing. Stop using what they're really saying without, knowing what they're saying is stop using your declarative memory to do something that is stored in non-declarative or procedural memory, right? So if you get out of your head and you just rely on your body and your muscle movements to perform the swing, you'll do it much better than if you think hard about it. And that's really displaying the difference between procedural memory and how we cognitively access declarative versus non-declarative memory. We're not cognitively or consciously accessing procedural memory. And when we start to think too hard about it, it starts to fall apart a little bit. So another example of this, think about a lecture you've given 100 times. All of us have been there, right? Those lectures become so ingrained and so automatic, they become like procedural memory. And what this can lead to is us just going through the motions of the lecture and not really paying attention to what students are thinking and their reactions to what we're saying. So a good recommendation here is if you're used to giving the same exact lecture all the time, try changing things up once a semester. So change a slide here or there, add a new concept, or take something out so that you're noticing and not just using non-declarative memory to give your lectures, so that you notice that, oh, there's something different. I got to really go back to declarative memory here and have it be less automatic. So certainly we all know that the best way to practice a lecture that we have to give is to do it over and over, and it becomes smoother and more procedural with time. That's because it's becoming less declarative. But that can sometimes, as I mentioned before, be problematic, because if things become too non-declarative, right? If things become too automatic for us, then we sometimes miss out on the experience of teaching, and our students sometimes don't benefit from that. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jamie for her to talk about memory phenomena.
Right? So we have to do that every time we talk about memory phenomena, and it literally comes out every time I say that word. It's so hard not to follow it with the tune there. It gets stuck in there like a brain worm. So we're just going to talk about a handful of them. There are so many. You could literally do an entire semester's worth of brain phenomena and in how they impact our learning, how they would impact the classroom. So we're just going to touch on a couple that we'll specifically give strategies for on Friday. Otherwise, we'd be here all semester. So the first one we mentioned on Monday when we were talking about the need for sleep and how sleep forms this kind of, it's restorative, it's reconstructive in the brain. You know, we have glial cells in our brains that go in there and they clean up after all the mess that the neurons leave all day, and they do most of that at night. And but the most important part of sleep in terms of learning is that while our brain is offline, we do see this kind of consolidation of the learning from the day. So while we're sleeping, we're constructing these new synapses and enlarging others. And all of that requires proteins and other materials to be synthesized within the neurons themselves. So because of these biochemical reactions that are building the scaffolding and the macromolecular complexes at the synapses, right? The sleep is essential. It takes so much energy to do. So the sleep is facilitating overall the bulk of that consolidation. We do see consolidation while we're awake, of course, but we'll see the bulk of it done while we're snoozing. That's why we say, you know, if you're going to study, if you're going to cram for an exam, at least cram the night before and try to get some sleep. Allow your brain to kind of, you know, put that in place, fix it, and be like, oh, yep, okay, I'm gonna make these connections right here. But one study actually revealed that just a 15-minute period of your eyes closed rest following learning actually enhances the memory of what was just learned, you know, like in the previous thing. So if you took the 15 minutes after this session, in between sessions, just close your eyes, work with that information a little bit, or even to just kind of meditate and relax, your brain's going to use that downtime to consolidate this information so that on Friday, when we're asking you to pull that back out, you're more likely to remember that. So maybe just take some time after the session and, you know, do some deep breathing while you're sitting there. But we also see that even briefer interludes are also helpful for learning, not as effective as sleep and not as effective then as that 15-minute period. But even pausing for less than a minute can actually work wonders in enabling the students to begin making better sense of the information, because it gives those neurons a chance to consolidate. So you can even take a break when you're presenting information that's as brief as 20 to 40 seconds and just allow them to think about it and allow that information that's in the short term and then moves into the working memory as they're processing it, and then it starts to make those connections in the long-term memory. So again, remind your students that if they're going to cram, at least get some sleep. Those that don't sleep after cramming tend to not perform as well because they're only working with the information in their working memory. They're not necessarily encoding it in their long-term memory. So they cram, as Courtney was describing on Monday, they cram in the information in before class. and they're working with it in their working memory. And then they sit down at their desk and the teacher's suddenly describing things, of what they should be focused on the exam, and all of a sudden that information is disrupted and moved out of their working memory. There's no chance for it to be consolidated. It's like counting out the change to somebody and they start saying a number and then suddenly you've been disrupted. That's what's happening with the students. So anything that they might have learned in that 5 minutes before classes start gets boop right out. The next phenomena we're going to talk about is distributed versus massed practice. And this is sometimes called spaced versus massed practice. And it really comes down to the difference between cramming and studying over a long period of time. What we find with spaced practice is that it does help us consolidate information more readily into our long-term memories rather than leaving it to kind of wither away in our working memories. So, good study habits involve studying just a little bit every day. If you have, in between exams, you have 4 weeks, right? So you're going to study for 20 minutes every day before the exam. That is spaced practice. You're doing a little bit, it's spaced equally across those days, across the interval between exams. Versus massed, when you don't do any work in the 4 weeks, and then maybe a day or two before or the morning of, depending on your student, of the exam, you cram it all in there and you study as much as you possibly can. That is massed practice, where you're putting it all together. I used to do this when I was taking piano lessons when I was little. I would practice the day before or the day of my lessons. And she knew every time I did that because my playing was abysmal. But if I practiced every single day, she noticed vast improvements week to week when I did it like that. That spaced practice allows those connections to get reinforced. So if you remember that slide from Monday where we just showed those 3 little neurons that are they're kind of close to one another, and then we show the next series where they're now in a nice straight line. That's about what you're going to get with massed practice, A and or B, depending on how much studying you're doing at time. But that the spaced practice allows you to build that really solid line, that well-worn path of connectivity, so that you're better able to retrieve those memories. So if we want to remind our students of this, and I love this meme, right? It's really kind of critical to say, I notice that you cram right before your exams, and that is a dangerous activity. Some students might actually do okay. They might do well, but that information, if you were to ask them 30 days, 60 days the next semester, is most likely not going to be in their long-term memory because they haven't made the appropriate number of connections there. Then we're going to talk about this other phenomena, about the reconstructive nature of memory. And I use this picture intentionally because we can talk all we want, in particular about episodic memories, but I talk about it intentionally because we see this cat back here, this cute little pudgy cat in the back. That's a reproduction. This image is a reproduction. It is accurate. That's exactly how big that cat is. That's exactly the color of the cat's eyes. That's exactly how long the whiskers are, right? It's a reproduction of that cat. This cake is more like what our memory is. It is a reconstruction. It is our best kind of attempt at reconstructing what that cat looks like in the form of cake and frosting. The color is not quite right with the nose. The eyes are definitely a darker green. The kind of ratio of or where things are on the cat's face is slightly askewed. They might have the tubbiness of the cat accurately demonstrated here. But again, we have to remember that our memories frequently fool us and they absolutely can fail us. And particularly when it comes to the episodic memories or the events in our lives. So when we're trying to actively recall an event, we're using cues and information that was available to us, as well as our emotional state at the time, how much other information we had competing for our attention at that time, et cetera. So we like to make this so if someone has a slightly different memory of an event than you do, just remember that we're all working with this cake cat and not the real cat. So, all right, that brings us to the end of our presentation today. And I want to remind us that this is part 2 of part 3. So we're going to be here on Friday where we're going to talk about strategies and techniques for teaching to the brain's strengths. We're going to take information from part 1 and from part 2 today and give you some strategies that you can use in your own classroom, give strategies that you can teach to your students so that they're better note takers, that they're better learners, so that it's easier for them to acquire the information, to really get it stuck there in their neocortex and their long-term learning in terms of, and then they can exhibit that to you on their assessments. So I hope you join us then. And thanks for joining us now. Thanks again, Courtney, particularly because you don't feel well today. So thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm going to stop the recording now. And if you have a couple questions,